At dawn, as life slowly returned to the grandmother's body, the alpha wolf raised its head, its eyes fixed on the dark stain of the luxury car hastily abandoned by the grandson. A deep howl echoed through the forest, a call the pack answered. There would be no blood, no direct confrontation with the coward. The punishment would be different. Under the alpha's silent command, the grey shadows advanced, and the sound of claws and teeth tearing rubber filled the cold air. The tires of the luxury car, a symbol of fortune and cruelty, would be shredded, a wild warning that nature, indeed, would take care of everything. But in its own way, the freezing morning brought not only sunlight, but also harsh reality for the grandson. Inside the luxurious SUV, warmed by a system that now seemed useless, he awoke from a restless, feverish sleep. Guilt, if it existed in his heart, was buried under layers of self-justification and the burning desire for inheritance. He stretched, a lazy yawn escaping his lips before reaching for his cell phone. No signal. Irritation began to bubble. The plan was simple. Drive back to the city, feign concern, and eventually mourn the tragic loss of his grandmother to the elements of nature. But nature, as he would soon discover, had its own plans. He opened the car door, the biting mountain air invading the cabin, and his eyes, still blurred by sleep and overconfidence, swept the landscape. That's when he saw it. Not one, but all four wheels of his precious vehicle were unrecognizable. High-performance tires torn to shreds, the rubber exposed in open wounds, the alloy rims scratched and dented. The visual impact was like a punch to the gut. "No! It can't be!" His voice, once arrogant, now sounded thin and full of disbelief. He ran to the first wheel, kneeling in the snow, his hands trembling as he touched the damage. It wasn't a flat tire. It was deliberate. Savage destruction. Claw and teeth marks were visible on the torn rubber, a pattern that belonged to no domestic animal or road accident. Panic began to creep in. He looked around, the dense, silent forest seeming to watch him. Where was his grandmother? He hadn't even bothered to look at the spot where he had left her. His concern was only for himself, for his car, for his escape. He tried to start the car, a vain hope that he might be able to move even with the destroyed tires. The engine rumbled, but the vehicle didn't budge, only sinking deeper into the snow, the rims scraping the ground. Impotence was a bitter poison in his mouth. He was trapped, completely and irremediably stuck in the middle of nowhere, with the snow beginning to fall again, fine and persistent. Meanwhile, a few yards away, in a clearing sheltered by ancient pines, the grandmother slowly opened her eyes. The fever had broken. The warmth of the alpha wolf's body, which had enveloped her all night, had warded off the deadly cold. She felt a strange softness beneath her head, the animal's warm, thick fur. Her blurred eyes focused on the majestic creature watching her with an almost human intensity. There was no fear, only a deep gratitude she couldn't express in words. The alpha wolf, sensing her awakening, let out a soft whine, a sound that seemed more like comfort than a warning. It rose with silent grace, but remained close, its muscular body a protective barrier against the hostile world. The grandmother tried to move, feeling the weakness in her limbs, but also a renewed strength that surprised her. She remembered the night, the pain, the abandonment, and the warmth that saved her. Her eyes met the wolf's again. There was an intelligence, an ancient wisdom in those golden eyes. He was no ordinary wild beast. He was her guardian. Back at the car, the grandson was in a frenzy. He kicked the SUV door, his anger exploding in a frustrated scream that echoed through the forest and was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He picked up his cell phone again, dialing frantically, but the absence of a signal was a sentence. The sun, which had once promised hope, now only illuminated his misfortune. He was alone, without communication, without escape. The falling snow seemed to mock him, covering the marks of his destroyed tires, erasing any trace of his passage. Fear, a feeling he rarely experienced, began to gnaw at his insides. What would he do? Walk? Where to? The nearest city was hours away, and the forest was an unforgiving labyrinth. He looked at the spot where he had left his grandmother. A pang of something that might have been remorse, or perhaps just the fear of being caught, shot through him. But the image of the inheritance quickly suppressed any hesitation. He didn't know that, while he shivered with cold and fear, his grandmother was being cared for, not by a human, but by a creature he considered wild and soulless. He didn't know that nature, in its relentless wisdom, had already begun to exact its price. The silence of the forest was not empty, it was expectant, and the grandson, the cowardly millionaire, was about to discover that, in the mountains, money didn't buy survival, and cruelty came at a very high cost. The game had only just begun, and he was not the hunter. He was the prey. The grandson's frustrated cry was lost in the thin mountain air, a pathetic sound against the silent immensity. He was trapped. The realization, heavy and cold as the snow that surrounded him, finally hit. The perfect plan, the guaranteed inheritance, all crumbled under the weight of shredded tires and an oppressive silence. He returned to the car, the luxurious interior now seeming like a gilded cage. He tried the radio, a vain hope for a human voice. Nothing but static. The cell phone, again, no signal. The car battery, however powerful, wouldn't solve the problem of locomotion. He was isolated. The raw, brutal reality of the mountains, which he so despised, now embraced him with icy claws. The arrogance that had accompanied him since birth began to unravel, revealing a layer of pure panic. Walk? Where to? The nearest city was an abstract concept, a distant mirage. The forest, which before was just a landscape to be ignored, now seemed alive, watching, judging. Every pine tree, every shadow seemed to hide an invisible threat. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was a presence, a relentless enemy that began to penetrate his bones. As the grandson struggled in his own trap a few yards away, the grandmother experienced a different awakening. The warmth of the alpha wolf, which had warmed her during the night, was a balm for her soul. She opened her eyes again, and the image of the wolf, so close, so majestic, was the first thing she saw. There was no more fever, only residual weakness and overwhelming gratitude. Her fingers, still trembling, moved instinctively, and she felt the soft, thick fur under her hand. A silent ancestral connection was established. The alpha wolf, sensing her movement, let out a soft growl, not of threat, but of encouragement. He moved away slightly, allowing her to try to sit up. With considerable effort, the grandmother managed to prop herself on her elbows. Her body ached, but the pain was bearable, a reminder that she was alive. Her eyes swept the clearing, and then in the distance, she saw the dark spot of the luxury SUV. The destroyed tires were visible even from afar, a silent testament to the wild intervention. A faint, almost imperceptible smile appeared on her lips. Nature, indeed, took care of everything. Back at the car, the grandson was in a state of denial and fury. He rummaged through the glove compartment, the center console, looking for something, anything that could offer a solution. A first aid kit, useless. Food, only a few forgotten cereal bars which he despised. Water, an empty bottle. The luxury of his vehicle was a cruel irony. He had everything, but nothing he truly needed to survive there. Hunger began to gnaw, and thirst scratched his throat. He felt smaller and smaller, more and more vulnerable. The image of his grandmother, whom he had abandoned, lingered in his mind, not out of guilt, but as a ghost of his own cowardice that now haunted him. He couldn't stay there. The cold would increase. The snow would continue to fall. With each passing minute, his chances dwindled. With a heavy sigh, he opened the car door again. The icy air hit him like a slap. He put on his designer coat, completely inadequate for the environment, and shoes that were more for show than for protection. The idea of walking was terrifying, but the alternative, freezing to death inside his luxury car, was even worse. He looked at the forest, at the white and green immensity stretching before him. There was no path, only trees, snow, and the silence that seemed to devour him. In the clearing, the grandmother, with the help of the alpha wolf, managed to stand. Her legs were shaky, but she felt her strength returning. The wolf watched her, its golden eyes fixed on her as if assessing her recovery. She leaned against a tree, breathing deeply the pure, cold air. The fever had carried away the impurities, and the forest, with its silent guardian, seemed to offer a new chance. She looked at the alpha wolf, and a genuine smile, full of gratitude and new hope, illuminated her wrinkled face. The life he had stolen, nature was returning in a way she could never have imagined. With a last look at the destroyed car, a monument to his own stupidity, the grandson took his first hesitant step into the deep snow. Each step was an effort, his feet sinking, the cold penetrating his shoes. He had no compass, no sense of direction, only a growing desperation to escape. The forest, once silent, now seemed to whisper with invisible voices, and he felt the eyes of something, or someone, on him. He didn't know that each step was taking him not away from death, but away from the only chance of redemption he might have had. He was entering nature's territory, and nature was ready to collect its due. The grandson's first step into the deep snow was a shock. His designer shoes, made for the polished asphalt of big cities, sank without resistance, engulfing his feet in the damp cold. The icy air cut his lungs with each breath, and the coat, though expensive, was a joke against the mountain's fury. He tried to walk in a straight line, but the forest was an endless labyrinth, each tree identical to the last, each shadow a trap. Panic, once a distant whisper, now screamed in his ears. He had no compass, no map, no idea where he was going. The snow, falling again in fine, persistent flakes, erased his footprints almost as quickly as he made them, as if nature itself wanted to erase his existence. The silence, once oppressive, now seemed to mock him, broken only by the gasping sound of his own breath and the crunch of snow beneath his feet. Each step was a Herculean effort. His legs, accustomed to the comfort of luxury cars and gym treadmills, began to burn. The cold penetrated his clothes, turning his fingers into insensitive blocks and his ears into icy needles. Hunger and thirst, once mere irritations, were now excruciating pains, reminding him of his fragility. He looked back, but the car had already disappeared into the white mist. A mirage of luxury and security he had abandoned out of his own stupidity. The forest, which he once saw as a mere backdrop, now became a living monster. Every snapping branch, every rustle of dry leaves, every dancing shadow was a threat. He imagined eyes watching him from behind the trees, felt the icy air on his neck like a breath. Paranoia began to corrode his mind, transforming loneliness into a prison of terror. Where was civilization? The nearest city seemed like a fairy tale, unattainable. As he dragged himself, a ghost of his former arrogance, the grandmother a few yards away, was in a different world. The alpha wolf, her silent guardian, had moved to a small cave, a natural recess in the rock, protected from the wind and snow. The ground was lined with dry leaves and moss, an improvised bed the wolf had prepared. The residual warmth of the animal's body still enveloped her, a comfort she would never have imagined finding. She sat, leaning against the cold cave wall, but the cold no longer bothered her as much. The fever had completely disappeared, leaving her with surprising mental clarity. Her eyes, once blurred, now watched the alpha wolf with almost reverent admiration. He was there, majestic and vigilant, his golden eyes fixed on the cave entrance, an imposing sentinel. The grandmother felt a renewed strength, an energy that came not from her own will, but from the connection with that wild creature. She slowly extended her hand, and the wolf, without averting its gaze from the entrance, allowed her to touch its thick fur. A current of energy, of mutual trust passed between them. There was no fear, only a deep understanding. She remembered the abandonment, the pain, the betrayal. But now, looking at the wolf, at the nature that had embraced her, there was no bitterness, only a strange peace. The grandson, with his greed and cruelty, had tried to steal her life, but the forest, in its ancestral wisdom, had given her a new one. She smiled faintly, a smile that contained the wisdom of a lifetime and gratitude for a second chance. Back in the relentless forest, the grandson stumbled on an exposed root, falling to his knees in the snow. The pain made him grunt, but the cold was more penetrating. He tried to stand, but his muscles were stiff, his limbs heavy. Despair deepened. He was lost, exhausted, and night was approaching, bringing with it an even more intense cold. He looked at the sky, where dark clouds promised more snow. The forest seemed to close in on him, the trees transforming into menacing figures. He was alone, completely alone, and the reality of his situation hit him with the force of lightning. There was no one to save him, no one to rescue him from his own trap. He didn't know that, a few yards away, the grandmother, warm and protected, was watching the sunset through the cave entrance with the alpha wolf by her side. She felt no pity, no anger, only the certainty that justice sometimes came from where it was least expected. The grandson, the hunter who became prey, was about to face the longest night of his life, while the grandmother, the victim, found refuge in the wild arms of nature. The game, in fact, had only just begun, and the forest was ready to deliver its final sentence. Night descended upon the forest like a heavy cloak of darkness and ice. For the grandson, fallen in the snow, every minute was an eternity of torment. The cold, once an inconvenience, was now a searing pain that penetrated his bones, paralyzing his muscles and robbing him of what little energy remained. He tried to get up again, but his legs wouldn't respond. His hands were numb, and with each movement a sharp pang shot through his exhausted body. Fear, once a whisper, was now a deafening scream in his mind. The forest, which during the day seemed merely indifferent, transformed into a living nightmare at night. Shadows danced and writhed, turning trees into monsters of twisted branches. Every crack in the ice, every rustle of dry leaves, was a menacing sound. He felt eyes on him, invisible yet intense, observing his every pathetic movement. Paranoia deepened, and he began to see fleeting shapes at the edges of his vision. Dark figures that seemed to lurk among the snow-covered pines. Hunger and thirst were now physical tortures. His stomach growled painfully, and his throat was so dry it felt like scratching with every attempt to swallow. He licked the snow, but the relief was minimal and temporary, only intensifying the cold in his mouth. The reality of his situation hit him with brutal force. He was dying. Far from any help, far from any civilization, he was at the mercy of the nature he so despised. Luxury, money, power. Everything crumbled to dust before the relentless indifference of the mountain. He huddled, trying uselessly to retain some body heat. His designer coat, a cruel joke against the winter, offered little protection. His shoes, now soaked and frozen, were weights on his insensitive feet. Tears, which he tried to hold back, streamed down his face, freezing into small, icy trails. They were not tears of regret, but of self-pity and despair. He did not mourn what he did to his grandmother, but what was happening to him. As the grandson drowned in his own icy hell a few yards away, the grandmother experienced a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The cave, a simple refuge, was a sanctuary. The alpha wolf's warmth radiated, heating the air around her, and the bed of moss and dry leaves was surprisingly comfortable. She watched the wolf, who remained vigilant at the entrance, his golden eyes shining in the gloom, like two guardian embers. The fever had completely dissipated, and with it, the fog that had obscured her mind. She felt a rare clarity, a deep connection with the environment around her. The silence of the night forest was not threatening, but comforting, filled only by the soft sound of the wind, and occasionally by the distant howl of a wolf, a sound that now brought not fear, but a strange sense of belonging. She reached out again, and the alpha wolf, without averting its gaze from the darkness outside, tilted its head slightly, allowing her to stroke its thick, soft fur. The texture was rough and warm, an anchor to reality. In that touch there was a silent exchange, an unspoken promise. He had saved her, and now he was her guardian. The grandmother thought of her grandson, of the cruel abandonment. For a moment, a pang of sadness hit her, not for the loss of the mansion or luxury, but for the loss of a grandson she had loved. But the sadness was soon replaced by a serene acceptance. Life had given her a second chance, a redemption amidst the wilderness. What he had tried to steal, nature had returned in a purer, truer form. She felt no anger, only a deep understanding that everyone reaped what they sowed. And the grandson's harvest was just beginning. Suddenly a howl echoed through the forest. Closer this time, a primal sound that made the grandson's blood run cold. It wasn't a solitary howl. Others responded, forming a chilling chorus that seemed to come from all directions. The alpha wolf in the cave raised its head, its eyes fixed on the darkness, and let out a low growl, almost inaudible, but charged with authority. The grandson, trembling uncontrollably, tried to drag himself behind a pine tree, as if the tree could offer some protection against whatever was approaching. He could feel the vibration of the howls in his chest, the sound growing more intense, closer. He imagined red eyes glowing in the darkness, sharp teeth, warm, hungry breath. Panic completely overwhelmed him. He didn't know that those howls were the pack's call, the summons for forest justice. The alpha wolf, her guardian, was communicating, and the message was clear. The intruder was there, vulnerable, and the night would be long and full of horrors. The grandson, who had considered himself the predator, was now the prey, and the forest, with its teeth and claws, was ready to exact its price. The grandmother, watching the alpha wolf, felt a wave of gratitude. Nature, in its wild wisdom, was balancing the scales. The game, in fact, had only just begun, and the final sentence was being written in the snow and ice of that relentless night. He was alone, but not unaccompanied. The eyes of the forest were upon him, and the pack was on its way. With each howl, the encirclement tightened and hope faded. The chorus of howls intensified, no longer a distant echo, but a wild symphony that seemed to vibrate in the very air, penetrating the grandson's bones. Each note was a hammer striking his sanity, a brutal reminder that he was not alone, but surrounded. The sound came from all directions, an invisible wall of threat closing in on him. His eyes, already blurred with exhaustion and cold, tried to pierce the darkness, searching for the shapes that paranoia painted in the dancing shadows. He saw red eyes, sharp teeth, silhouettes lurking among the twisted trunks, each one a harbinger of his imminent end. Panic, once a cold knot in his stomach, was now a wave of nausea that churned within him. He tried to scream, but his throat was so dry and constricted that only a hoarse wheeze escaped. The cold was no longer just pain. It was a stupor spreading, numbing his limbs. But his mind, paradoxically, was in a state of hypervigilance, every fiber of his being screaming for survival. He dragged himself, using his last strength to hide behind a snow-covered pine, as if the thin layer of branches could offer some protection against the primordial force that was approaching. The smell of pine and frozen earth mingled with the metallic scent of his own cold sweat, a nauseating cocktail of despair. He was on the verge of collapse, terrified and completely helpless. As the grandson drowned in his icy hell a few yards away, the grandmother in the cave heard the same howls. But for her, the sound was different. It was not a threat, but a song of belonging, a call to order. The alpha wolf, by her side, raised its head, its golden eyes fixed on the cave entrance, but without a hint of fear. A low growl, almost a murmur, escaped its throat, a silent response, a command that only the forest could understand. The grandmother felt a wave of gratitude and a strange sense of power. Nature, in its wild wisdom, was moving, and she was part of it. Far from the cave, but guided by the alpha's call, the shadows moved. They were the other wolves of the pack, moving with silent, lethal grace through the snow. Their eyes, like embers in the darkness, were fixed on a single point, the luxury car, the symbol of arrogance and abandonment. The vehicle, once a sanctuary of technology and comfort, now lay inert, a gleaming anomaly in the wild landscape. The wolves approached, sniffing the cold metal, the smell of gasoline and rubber, an intrusion into their ancestral domain. With instinctive coordination, the pack surrounded the car. There was no hesitation, only a cold, calculated purpose. A wolf, larger and darker than the others, was the first. With a low growl, it sank its sharp teeth into the front tire, tearing the rubber with surprising force. The sound of the tear echoed in the night, a dry, violent sound that seemed to pierce the forest's silence. Other wolves followed suit, attacking the remaining tires with contained fury. The rubber yielded, air hissed out, and the tires, once full and robust, deflated in a slow, agonizing lament. Not satisfied, the wolves scratched the glossy paint with their claws, leaving deep, brutal marks, disfiguring the impeccable shine of the metal. The rearview mirrors were ripped off, the windshield wipers twisted. The car, which represented the grandson's escape and salvation, was being systematically dismantled, transformed into a useless carcass, a monument to his own ruin. The smell of burnt rubber and scratched metal filled the icy air, a warning, a sentence. The grandson, at a distance that seemed infinite, felt an even deeper chill. Although he couldn't see, he felt the violence in the air, the destructive energy emanating from that part of the forest. He heard distant sounds, cracks and tears that his terrified mind couldn't identify, but which filled his heart with even greater fear, the hope that his car could still be his refuge, his bridge back to civilization, disintegrated with each sound. He was truly trapped now, with no escape route, no salvation. Night advanced, and with it, the relentless sentence of the forest. The alpha wolf in the cave watched the grandmother, its golden eyes reflecting the quietude of the night. It had fulfilled its part. The grandmother, in turn, felt the forest's energy pulsating around her, an ancient and just force. She knew that the grandson, who had tried to steal her life, was now at the mercy of a force that knew no pity. The game, in fact, had only just begun, and the forest, with its teeth and claws, was ready to exact its final price, making it clear that human arrogance was insignificant before wild majesty. The grandson, huddled behind the pine tree, felt the echo of the snapping and tearing sounds coming from the direction of the car as direct blows to his chest. Each sound was a nail hammered into the coffin of his hope. He couldn't see the devastation, but his mind, already distorted by cold and panic, painted pictures of unspeakable horror. He imagined claws tearing metal, teeth ripping pieces, a savage fury descending upon the last link that bound him to civilization. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline, faint but perceptible, mingled with the pungent odor of his own cold sweat, a nauseating cocktail of despair. His fingers, numb and swollen, tried uselessly to cling to the rough bark of the pine, as if the tree could absorb his terror. The cold, once a sharp pain, was now a paralysis creeping up his legs, numbing his limbs, but sharpening his mind to every slightest sound. He heard the rustle of dry leaves, the creak of branches under an invisible weight, the whisper of the wind that seemed to carry macabre laughter. The forest, once an indifferent backdrop, had become a living, pulsating entity, with eyes and ears in every shadow, in every tree. The hope of starting the engine and fleeing, of returning to the road and the world he knew, completely disintegrated. His car, the symbol of his wealth and his escape, was now just a useless carcass, a monument to his own arrogance. He was trapped, completely and irremediably trapped. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the stomach, knocking the little air left in his frozen lungs. A scream of pure terror and frustration tried to escape, but it was muffled by a dry sob, caught in his throat. He was no longer the predator, the manipulator. He was the prey, and the hunt had only just begun. As the grandson drowned in his own private hell, the grandmother in the cave watched the alpha wolf. It had turned, its golden eyes now fixed on her, as if reading her soul. There was no fear, only an ancestral wisdom, a deep understanding of the balance being restored. The grandmother felt the change in the forest's energy. The frenzy of destruction had ceased, replaced by a tense quietude, an expectation. The howls, once a chorus of summons, were now more sparse, closer, like whispers of a closing conspiracy. She reached out and stroked the wolf's warm fur, feeling the contained strength in its body. The connection between them was undeniable, an alliance forged in ice and betrayal. The grandmother felt no pity for her grandson, only a serene, almost mystical acceptance that nature, in its wild wisdom, was balancing the scales. What he had tried to steal, her life, her dignity, her very existence, was being repaid with interest by the forest, and the grandmother in some way was a witness, an integral part of this primordial judgment. Far from the cave, but guided by instinct and the alpha's silent command, the wolves moved away from the mutilated carcass of the car. Their eyes, like embers in the darkness, swept the landscape, sniffing the air for a new trail, a new target. The grandson's scent, imbued with fear and despair, was unmistakable. He was not far. With silent coordination, the pack began to move. There was no rush, only relentless determination. They spread out, forming a semicircle, each wolf a moving point of darkness, gliding between the trees with lethal grace. Their steps were almost inaudible in the soft snow, only the occasional rustle of a leaf or the snap of a twig under a paw. The silence, once a comfort to the grandmother, became a harbinger of dread for the grandson. He listened. He heard the silence that was not silence, but the absence of sound that precedes the hunt. The wind stopped blowing. The trees seemed to hold their breath. His eyes, wide with terror, desperately tried to discern shapes in the darkness, but only saw dancing shadows that transformed into monsters with each blink. He felt the encirclement closing in, not just in his mind, but physically. The air seemed denser, heavier, laden with the promise of teeth and claws. A low howl, almost a lament, echoed from a distant point and was answered by another, closer, and another, even closer. These were not howls of summons, but of communication, of coordination. The voice of the pack now spoke directly to him. Each howl was a step closer, a confirmation that he was the center of their attention. The grandson tried to shrink even further, wishing he could merge with the tree, disappear into the snow. But there was nowhere to go. He was naked, exposed, an insignificant speck in the vast and unforgiving tapestry of the forest. Night advanced, and with it, nature's relentless sentence. The alpha wolf in the cave watched the grandmother, its golden eyes reflecting the quietude of the night. It had fulfilled its part, and the pack was fulfilling theirs. The grandmother, in turn, felt the forest's energy pulsating around her, an ancient and just force. She knew that the grandson, who had tried to steal her life, was now at the mercy of a force that knew no pity. The game, in fact, had only just begun, and the forest, with its teeth and claws, was ready to exact its final price, making it clear that human arrogance was insignificant before wild majesty. And the grandson, alone, without a car, without hope, felt the first icy touch of a snout on his boot. The icy touch of the snout on his boot was not a shock, but the confirmation of a nightmare already unfolding in his mind. It was real. The grandson froze, every fiber of his being screaming to run, but his body, betrayed by cold and fear, refused to obey. The air in his lungs seemed to solidify, and the sound of his own breath, gasping and noisy, was the only thing he could hear besides the frantic beating of his heart. He dared not look down. His eyes, wide with terror, were fixed on the darkness ahead, as if he could conjure an escape merely by not acknowledging the imminent threat. But the scent... oh, the scent was unmistakable. A wild, earthy, damp odor, mixed with the pungent aroma of a predator, filled his nostrils, suffocating him. It was the smell of death, or something very close to it. A low, guttural growl vibrated against the leather of his boot, and he felt the warmth of the animal's breath. It was not a warning growl, but one of assessment, of macabre curiosity. The wolf was there, inches away, studying him, sensing his fear. And then a second touch, firmer, a paw lightly pressing his leg, as if testing the resistance of its prey. Slowly, with agonizing pain in every muscle, the grandson moved his eyes downward. The darkness was almost total, but the pale light of the snow reflected in the amber eyes that stared back at him. It wasn't the alpha wolf, he realized with an even deeper chill. It was another. A large, dark-furred wolf with teeth that gleamed like daggers in the gloom. And then the shadows around him began to stir. A pair of gleaming eyes emerged to his left, then another to his right, and one more behind him. The pack. They weren't just approaching, they were already there, surrounding him, emerging from the veil of night like hungry specters. Every movement was silent, every breath almost inaudible, but their presence was overwhelming, an invisible wall of teeth and claws. The grandson tried to shrink even further against the pine, but the tree, once a refuge, now seemed merely a post to which he was tied. He was naked, exposed, a point of flesh and bone in a circle of predators. The cold, once a physical pain, was now an ally of terror, numbing his limbs, but sharpening his mind to the inevitability. The wolves did not advance all at once. They moved in a slow, calculated circle, sniffing the air, their muzzles pointed at him. Each step in the soft snow was a whisper, each head movement a silent threat. They were toying with him, prolonging the torment, savoring the fear emanating from his body. It was psychological torture, more cruel than any immediate physical attack. One of the wolves, bolder, stepped forward, growling low. The sound was like coarse sand scraping stone, a clear warning. The grandson felt the strong scent of the animal, the warmth of its body, and a primal panic invaded him. He wanted to scream, wanted to beg, but his throat was dry, paralyzed. The image of his grandmother, burning with fever in the snow, abandoned by him, flashed in his mind like lightning. It wasn't remorse, not really. It was more a cruel irony, the scales of wild justice balancing in a way he could never have foreseen. He had left his grandmother to die of cold, and now the cold and the wolves were coming for him. In the cave, the grandmother watched the alpha wolf. Its golden eyes, fixed on her, seemed to reflect the image of the forest, of its relentless justice. She felt the tense quietude that had settled, the silence that was not an absence of sound, but the pause before the climax. The forest's energy pulsed around her, an ancient and just force. She knew that the grandson, who had tried to steal her life, was now at the mercy of a force that knew no pity. Far away, the grandson felt one of the wolves approach from behind. An icy snout touched the back of his neck, and he felt the sharp tip of a tooth lightly scrape his skin. It was not an attack, but a provocation, a reminder of his vulnerability. A shiver ran down his spine, and he closed his eyes tightly, wishing it was all a nightmare. But when he opened them again, the reality was even more brutal. The wolves had tightened the circle. Their eyes, now more visible in the growing darkness, were like incandescent embers, each one a promise of pain. The air was heavy with anticipation, and the grandson knew that the game of cat and mouse was coming to an end. He was no longer the predator, the manipulator. He was the prey, and the hunt was about to become a carnage. A low, prolonged howl echoed in the forest, not from one of the nearby wolves, but from a distant point, deeper in the woods. It was the alpha's call, the silent permission. And with that sound, the hesitation of the wolves around the grandson vanished. Their growls grew louder, more aggressive. The wolf in front of him took a step forward, and the grandson saw the tension in its body, the readiness to attack. He was completely and irremediably trapped. Night advanced, and with it, nature's relentless sentence. The first tooth, sharp as a blade, sank into his flesh. The first tooth, sharp as a blade, sank into his flesh. It wasn't a clean strike, but an exploratory bite, a brutal warning that tore skin and muscle. A scream ripped from the grandson's throat, a raw, animalistic sound lost in the vastness of the forest. The shock of pain was immediate, an icy fire that spread through his leg, mingling with the paralyzing cold that already consumed him. He felt the damp warmth of blood trickling, a macabre contrast to the ice around him. That first touch was the signal. As if an invisible barrier had been broken, the wolves around him erupted into action. There was no hesitation, no pity. The air filled with guttural growls, the snap of branches under heavy paws, and the wet sound of tearing teeth. Suddenly he was no longer a man, but a piece of meat, a living toy for a hungry pack. A wolf grabbed his other leg, pulling him with surprising force, dragging him away from the pine tree. He felt sharp claws digging into his back, into his arms, as he desperately tried to cling to anything, any hope of resistance. But there was nothing, only the cold snow and the relentless darkness. Panic completely overwhelmed him. It wasn't the calculated fear from before, but a primal terror, the certainty of annihilation. He rolled, kicked, tried to defend himself with bare hands, but his movements were slow, clumsy, ineffective against the animal's agility and ferocity. Each bite was a wave of excruciating pain, each tug a threat of dismemberment. He smelled his own blood, warm and metallic, mingling with the wild odor of the wolves. The forest, once a backdrop for his arrogance, was now the stage for his execution. Amidst the chaos, a fleeting image flashed in his mind. His grandmother's pale face, burning with fever, abandoned in the snow. There was no remorse, only a bitter understanding of the irony. He had left her to die of cold, and now the cold and the forest's teeth were coming for him. The scales of wild justice were not blind. They were relentless, and their interest was paid in flesh and bone. He was not the predator, the manipulator. He was the prey, and the hunt had become a carnage. Far away, in the quietude of the cave, the grandmother watched the alpha wolf. Its golden eyes, fixed on her, seemed to reflect the image of the forest, of its relentless justice. She felt the tense quietude that had settled, the silence that was not an absence of sound, but the pause before the climax. The forest's energy pulsed around her, an ancient and just force. She knew that the grandson, who had tried to steal her life, was now at the mercy of a force that knew no pity. A distant howl, more a lament than a summons, echoed through the trees. and the grandmother felt a profound peace. Nature was balancing the scales. Back in the icy darkness, the grandson felt his body being dragged. The snow, once a soft surface, now seemed to abrade his skin, mixing with blood and earth. The wolves were not killing him quickly, they were prolonging the torment, testing his resistance, savoring every moment of his agony. He felt a strong tug on his shoulder, and the pain made him scream again, a hoarse, desperate sound that mingled with the growls and howls of the pack. His limbs were heavy, his movements increasingly slow. Consciousness began to fail, coming and going in flashes of pain and terror. He tried to open his eyes, but the darkness was almost total, punctuated only by the wolves' shining eyes, like incandescent embers in a circle of death. He could no longer distinguish one wolf from another. They were an amorphous mass of teeth and claws, a single entity of destruction. The cold, once a physical pain, was now an ally of terror, numbing his limbs, but sharpening his mind to the inevitability. He felt the last remnant of his dignity drain away, reduced to a wounded animal, awaiting the final blow. His grandson's world, once so vibrant in its arrogance and certainty, disintegrated into a whirlwind of pain and darkness. The last tug was not just physical. It was the final tearing of the veil of his existence, the rupture of his consciousness from brutal reality. The sound of teeth and claws, the metallic smell of his own blood, the cold that penetrated to the soul, everything merged into a dissonant chorus that dragged him into the abyss. There was no time for regret, nor for a full understanding of the irony that sealed his fate. Only pain, pure and overwhelming, followed by an icy void that swallowed every sensation, every thought. His eyes, once focused on survival, now fixed on a non-existent point, as the light of life extinguished, pixel by pixel, like a screen losing power. The forest, once a stage for his cruelty, was now his tomb, his judge, and his executioner. But the forest's justice did not end with the last breath. The pack, under the alpha wolf's silent command, did not linger on the body lying in the snow. There was a greater purpose, a message to be etched into the icy landscape, a lesson to be taught about the futility of wealth and technology against the brute force of nature. Like a well-trained army, the wolves dispersed, not in search of new prey, but to fulfill the second part of the sentence. Their steps were swift and determined, their lean forms gliding between the trees, leaving behind the heavy silence of death. They knew where to go. The smell of cold metal, luxurious leather, and gasoline, an affront to nature's purity, guided them. There it was, the symbol of the arrogance and greed that had driven the grandson. The luxury car, a gleaming SUV, standing like a technological aberration in the middle of the pristine landscape. Its elegant lines and expensive paint seemed to mock the wild simplicity around it, a monument to human pretension. But not for long. The wolves, with contained but relentless ferocity, converged on the vehicle. It was not hunger that moved them now, but vengeance, retribution, the need to dismantle every piece of man's illusion of control. Their muzzles sniffed the tire, the dark, resistant rubber, but not invulnerable to teeth and claws forged by nature. The first wolf sank its canines into the side of the tire, tearing the rubber with a hissing, satisfying sound. The compressed air escaped with a sharp whistle, and the tire began to deflate, the car tilting slightly, like a wounded giant losing its balance. One by one, the other wolves joined, their teeth sharp as blades, their claws tearing at the rubber, the metal, whatever was within reach. It was not just the destruction of the tires, it was the deconstruction of his power, his escape, his very identity. The car, once a refuge and a means of control, was now just a useless carcass, stuck in the snow, as helpless as its owner had become. Each tear in the rubber was an echo of the tear in the grandson's flesh, each deflated tire, a symbol of his emptied life. The violence was methodical, almost ritualistic, a clear message from the forest. No human artifice is superior to its will. Glass shattered under heavy paws, leather upholstery was ripped, and the smell of gasoline mingled with the wild odor of the animals, creating a symphony of destruction that echoed in the night. In the quietude of the cave, the grandmother felt the change in the air. The distant howl that had sealed the grandson's fate now transformed into a different silence, a silence of conclusion and peace. She did not hear the sounds of the carnage, nor the cracking of the car being dismantled, but she felt the forest's energy readjust, the balance settling. The alpha wolf, watching her with its golden eyes, took a step forward, its head held high, its body exuding an aura of power and satisfaction. There was no cruelty in its gaze, only the cold, relentless justice of nature. It had fulfilled its promise, protected its charge, and punished the transgressor. The grandmother, still weak, but with the fever subsiding and strength slowly returning, felt a wave of gratitude and reverence. The forest, with its ancestral wisdom, had acted. She had been saved by a force the grandson could never have understood or mastered. Dawn approached, bringing with it a pale light that began to tint the horizon with shades of grey and pink. The snow, once a shroud of death, now seemed like a clean sheet, washing away the impurities of the night, ready for a new beginning. The luxury car, once a symbol of power and status, lay disfigured, its tires torn, its promise of escape and impunity shattered. The forest had spoken, and its voice was that of the wolves, of the icy winds, of the very wild essence that the grandson had despised. For the grandmother, it was the beginning of a new day, a second chance, a rebirth. For the grandson, it was the end, the last page of a story written in greed and sealed in blood. Nature did not forgive, but it offered redemption to those who respected it. And now, in the quietude of the cave, with the warmth of the alpha wolf by her side, the grandmother knew that her journey was only just beginning, guided by a force greater than any fortune or mansion. In the quietude of the cave, a new dawn announced itself, not just for the world outside, but for the grandmother's soul. The silence, once a harbinger of terror, was now a balm, a cloak of peace that enveloped every fiber of her being. The fever, which for days had consumed her in a private hell, finally subsided, leaving behind only a deep weariness and a mental clarity she hadn't felt in years. Her eyes, once blurred by illness, now watched the alpha wolf with a gratitude that transcended words, a silent reverence for the life that had been returned to her. The warmth of the alpha's body beside her was not just physical, it was an anchor, living proof that she was not alone, that she had been chosen, protected by a force the grandson could never have understood or mastered. Its golden eyes, once embers in the darkness, now reflected the pale light beginning to invade the cave, revealing the depth of its ancestral wisdom. There was no cruelty there, only the cold, relentless justice of nature, tempered by an unexpected compassion. The grandmother felt the forest's energy readjust, the balance settling. She didn't need to see the carnage, nor hear the cracking of the car being dismantled. She felt the conclusion in the air, the peace that settled after the storm. The distant howl that had sealed the grandson's fate now transformed into a different silence, a silence of conclusion and peace, an epilogue to the tragedy and a prologue to her rebirth. With an effort, she moved her hand, feeling the roughness of the alpha wolf's fur. It did not pull away, allowing the touch, a tacit acceptance of the connection that had been forged between them. In that moment, the mansion, the fortune, the family intrigues, everything seemed distant, futile, like a bad dream from which she had finally awakened. What mattered was life, breath, warmth, the connection to something greater and truer than any material wealth. Dawn approached, tinging the horizon with shades of grey and pink, a promise of a new day. The snow, once a shroud of death, now seemed like a clean sheet, washing away the impurities of the night, ready for a new beginning. The grandmother imagined the luxury car outside, the symbol of her grandson's arrogance and greed, lying disfigured, its tires torn, its promise of escape and impunity shattered. The forest had spoken, and its voice was that of the wolves, of the icy winds, of the very wild essence that the grandson had despised. For her, it was the beginning of a new day, a second chance, a rebirth. For the grandson, it was the end, the last page of a story written in greed and sealed in blood. Nature did not forgive, but it offered redemption to those who respected it. And now, in the quietude of the cave, with the warmth of the alpha wolf by her side, the grandmother knew that her journey was only just beginning, guided by a force greater than any fortune or mansion. She was no longer the fragile, abandoned old woman. She had been tempered by the cold, healed by the wild warmth, and reborn under the watchful eye of the forest. Her values had been rewritten, her perspective transformed. The idea of returning to civilization, to human rules and pretensions, now seemed like a prison, a distant echo of a life she no longer recognized as her own. The freedom she felt there, in the brutal and honest simplicity of nature, was more valuable than any inheritance. The alpha wolf stood, stretching with powerful grace, and looked towards the cave entrance. There was no hurry, but purpose in its movements. The grandmother felt a call, an instinctive understanding that it was time to move, to follow. She rose with difficulty, feeling the weakness in her legs, but also a new strength, a resilience that surprised her. The forest had exacted its price, and the silence that followed was proof that justice at times has teeth and claws. But it also had a heart, a wild warmth that had saved a life and forged a new path. The grandmother, the woman who had been abandoned to die, now walked towards an uncertain future, but one filled with a truth and a connection that the civilized world could never offer. She was home, not in a mansion, but in the wild heart of the forest, under the protection of her golden-eyed guardian. The icy morning air, once a relentless enemy, now felt like an invigorating embrace. Each breath filled the grandmother's lungs with a raw, wild energy that awakened every cell in her body. With the alpha wolf leading, its movements fluid and silent as the very snow that surrounded them, she took her first step out of the cave. Weakness was still an invisible current trying to hold her back, but determination, forged in the furnace of pain and betrayal, was a fire that propelled her. Her knees trembled, her muscles protested, but she refused to fall. Not anymore. The sun, still low on the horizon, cast long bluish shadows over the untouched landscape, transforming the snow into a carpet of shimmering diamonds. It was a world of brutal beauty, a stark contrast to the polished corridors and luxurious tapestries of the mansion she once called home. That place, with its walls that guarded secrets and its memories of a life of appearances, now seemed a distant echo, a discordant melody that no longer resonated in her soul. She had been liberated, not just from the fever, but from the gilded cage of her former existence. The alpha wolf stopped, turning its head to look at her. Its golden eyes, now bathed in the dawn light, held no judgment, only an ancestral patience, a tacit understanding of her struggle. It was a silent invitation to follow, to trust the instinct that had pulled her back from the brink of death. She took a deep breath, the vapor of her breath mingling with the cold air, and took another step. Then another. Each movement was a victory, each step an affirmation of her new life. It did not rush her, adjusting its pace to hers as if it knew exactly how much she could bear. It was a silent dance of trust and leadership, a bond forged in adversity. The grandmother watched the powerful form of the alpha ahead of her. its thick grey fur blending perfectly with the environment, and felt a security that no bodyguard or high-tech security system could ever have offered. Nature, in its wildest essence, was now her protector, her guide, her home. As they moved, the forest's silence was broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the whispering wind through the pines. She noticed the fresh tracks of other wolves, lighter but equally determined, moving away from the cave towards a more distant point in the forest. The pack. They had done their part, dismantling the symbol of her grandson's arrogance. Now, the path ahead was unknown, but she felt no fear. The only thing that scared her was the idea of going back to the emptiness of her old life. The grandmother knew it wouldn't be easy. The forest offered no comforts, no luxuries. Survival would require strength, cunning, and an adaptability she, in her former life, never imagined she possessed. But there was a flame lit within her, a resilience that the cold snow and her grandson's betrayal could not extinguish. She would learn to read the forest's signs, to find food, to protect herself. She would learn to be wild, just as the alpha wolf was wild. The day advanced, and with it, the raw reality of the forest imposed itself. The initial warmth of dawn gave way to a more penetrating cold that seemed to seep into her bones. Hunger, once a distant sensation, now gnawed at her stomach with increasing ferocity. Her muscles, already sore, began to burn with continuous effort. She was not young, and her body, even revitalized, had its limits. The alpha wolf, attentive, noticed her slowing down. It stopped again, not with impatience, but with a calculated observation. Its eyes swept the landscape, searching for something the grandmother could not decipher. Then, with a sudden movement, it veered into a dense thicket of pines, sniffing the snow-covered ground. The grandmother followed, curiosity overcoming fatigue. The alpha began to dig with its front paws, snow flying in small white clouds. In a few moments it unearthed something, a dark, gnarled root, which it offered to her with its snout. It was a wild chicory root, bitter but edible. Hesitantly, the grandmother took it. The taste was earthy and strong, but the sensation of something in her stomach was a welcome relief. It was the first lesson in survival, the first proof that the forest, though relentless, also provided, and the alpha was her teacher. They continued. The sun began its descent, painting the sky orange and purple, announcing the arrival of another icy night. The grandmother knew she couldn't spend another night exposed, not in her condition. The alpha wolf seemed to share this urgency. It quickened its pace, leading her over rougher terrain until they spotted an imposing rock formation. It wasn't a deep cave like the previous one, but a natural shelter, a recess protected from the wind, with a small crevice that promised a little more isolation. As they approached, the grandmother noticed something different. There was a scent, a wild and familiar odor, but not threatening. Inside the shelter, huddled together for warmth, were 3 wolf pups, small and furry, with curious eyes that opened when they saw them. They were the alpha wolf's pups, the next generation of the pack. The mother, a lighter furred wolf, raised her head but did not growl. Her eyes, though cautious, showed no hostility. She recognized the alpha and the woman beside him. It was a moment of profound revelation. The grandmother was not being led into solitary exile, but into the heart of the family, into the core of the pack. She was no longer an intruder, but a guest, perhaps even a part. The warmth of the pups, the protective gaze of the mother, the silent presence of the alpha, everything united in an overwhelming understanding. Her new life would not just be about surviving, but about belonging. She knelt, feeling the cold of the rock, but the warmth emanating from the small bodies of the pups was a comfort. They were the promise of continuity, of life that persisted despite everything. The alpha wolf lay down at the entrance of the shelter, its massive body forming a barrier against the wind and cold. The mother wolf approached the grandmother, sniffing her with curiosity before cuddling up again with her pups. The grandmother felt a peace she had never experienced in the mansion, surrounded by luxury and loneliness. There, in the growing darkness of the rocky shelter, with the soft sound of the wolves breathing and the smell of the forest, she knew she had found her true home. The tension of survival still existed, but now it was tempered by acceptance, by connection. She was no longer the rich, abandoned grandmother. She was part of the pack, a silent guardian, a witness to wildlife. And the night, which had once promised only cold and despair, now brought the promise of safe sleep, warmed by the presence of her new family. The outside world, with its fortunes and betrayals, seemed more distant than ever. Here in the forest, the only currency was life, and she was alive, and she belonged. The first light of dawn crept through the rocky crevice, painting the interior of the shelter with pale shades of grey and blue. The grandmother opened her eyes, and for an instant confusion enveloped her. Where was she? The smell of damp earth, pine, and a wild, warm aroma filled her nostrils. Then, the memory of the previous night hit her like a cold but not unpleasant wave. She was nestled among the small, furry bodies of the wolf pups, feeling the gentle warmth emanating from them. The mother wolf was inches away, her breathing deep and rhythmic. The alpha wolf, a grey and imposing wall, slept at the entrance, its body a living barrier against the outside world. There were no silk sheets, no soft goose-down mattress. There was no sterile silence of an empty mansion. There was the occasional whimper of a dreaming pup, the rustle of the wind outside, and the pulsating warmth of wild lives around her. And to her surprise, she had slept better than in years. The fever had completely dissipated, leaving behind only a slight weakness and a mental clarity she hadn't felt since her youth. She moved carefully, trying not to disturb the little ones. One of the pups, with a dark patch over its eye, raised its head and looked at her with curious blue eyes before yawning and snuggling down again. The grandmother slowly extended her hand, and the small, furry snout brushed against her fingers, a touch of innocent trust. It was a connection that transcended language, a pure and unreserved acceptance. The alpha wolf awoke with an almost imperceptible movement, its golden eyes fixed on her, a silent question. She nodded, a slight curve to her lips. "I'm well," she whispered, her voice still hoarse. It stood, stretching with powerful grace, and left the shelter. The mother wolf raised her head, sniffed the air, and followed the alpha, casting a last glance at the grandmother and her pups. It was a silent invitation to stay, to care, to belong. The grandmother knew she needed to move. The morning cold intensified, and hunger began to gnaw again. But for a moment, she allowed herself to enjoy that warmth, that feeling of being needed. She watched the pups, their small paws moving in dreams, the wild instinct already pulsating in their hearts. They were the future, the continuity of life in the forest. And she, in some way, had become part of that continuity. When the mother wolf returned, a freshly caught rabbit dangling from her mouth, the grandmother felt a mixture of gratitude and a pang of reality. The forest provided, but it demanded effort. Hunting death. She couldn't hunt, but she could learn. The alpha watched her from the entrance as if reading her thoughts. It didn't expect her to become a hunter, not yet, but it expected her to learn to survive. The day unfolded in a series of silent lessons. The alpha led her to a nearby stream where the icy, clear water quenched her thirst. It showed her which berries, still scarce in the snow, were edible, and which roots could be unearthed. She learned to read the forest's signs, to listen to the wind's whisper, to identify tracks in the snow. Her eyes, once accustomed to the artificial gleam of civilization, now adjusted to nature's subtle hues. The tension, however, was not just in the struggle for survival. There was a distant echo of her past, a shadow the forest could not erase. As the alpha sniffed the air, its ears perked up, and it let out a low, almost inaudible growl. The grandmother followed its gaze and, in the distance, through the dense curtain of pines, saw a faint smoke rising into the sky. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it wasn't smoke from a wild campfire. It was the smell of burning fuel, of heated metal. Her grandson. He hadn't given up, or perhaps he was looking for her, not to save her, but to confirm her death, to ensure the mansion was his. A chill ran down the grandmother's spine, not of fear, but of renewed anger. That monster, her own blood, still tried to extend his claws to her, even in the vastness of the forest. The alpha wolf, sensing the change in her mood, turned to her. Its golden eyes were serious, but firm. It did not lead her back to the shelter, nor hide her. Instead, it guided her along a different path, deeper into the forest, to higher ground. It was as if it wanted her to see, to understand the threat, but also the strength they possessed together. From atop a rocky ridge, the grandmother could see more clearly. There was a helicopter, small and distant, hovering over the area where the luxury SUV had been destroyed. It was a search, yes, but a search that revealed her grandson's coldness. He wasn't looking for a living grandmother, but for a body. Proof. The sight ignited a new flame within her, a determination that physical weakness could no longer shake. She was no longer the fragile old woman he had abandoned. She was a survivor. And the forest, with its dangers and its gifts, was now her sanctuary, her training ground. The alpha wolf, her silent guide, had led her to a world where justice was wild and relentless, and where life was lived on its own terms. The grandmother looked at the helicopter, a small fly buzzing in the vast, indifferent sky. She no longer felt the despair of being a victim. She felt the strength of the pack, the cunning of nature. She had been abandoned to die, but she had been reborn. And now she was not just surviving, she was preparing for what was to come, for the inevitable confrontation. The mansion, the fortune, the legacy, all of it was still there, waiting. But now the grandmother had an army of grey furs, golden eyes, and sharp instincts. And she was no longer the prey. She was part of the predator. The adventure, which once seemed like an escape, now revealed itself as a journey of empowerment, a preparation for revenge. The small fly buzzing in the sky, her grandson's helicopter, was a constant reminder of the world she had left behind. But now, it was not a reminder of despair, but of an imminent battle. She was no longer fleeing. She was positioning herself. The alpha wolf, sensing the change in her spirit, did not lead her back to the shelter. Instead, it guided her through the trees, along paths only wolves knew, to a hidden clearing, a strategic observation point. There, the pack waited. It wasn't just the pups and the mother wolf. There were golden and grey eyes watching her from the dense undergrowth, lean, powerful bodies moving like shadows. The entire pack. They were there, not as a threat, but as a united force, awaiting their alpha's silent command. And she, the grandmother, the woman who had been abandoned to die, was at the center of it all, an intrinsic part of that wild unity. The helicopter landed some distance away, near what remained of the luxury SUV. The smoke from the burning fuel still hung in the air, an acrid smell that contrasted with the clean, cold aroma of the forest. She watched her grandson descend, accompanied by two sturdy men, likely security guards. He wore an expensive fur coat, leather gloves, and his eyes, even from a distance, seemed hungry, not with concern but with impatience. He wanted to find the body, close the chapter, and inherit. A wave of icy fury coursed through the grandmother. It wasn't the impotent rage from before, but a controlled anger, sharpened by survival and the pack's loyalty. She was no longer a victim, she was a force. The alpha wolf growled low, a guttural sound that vibrated on the ground. It was a warning, a call. The other wolves moved, not in attack, but in a silent encirclement invisible to human eyes. They knew every trail, every shadow, every sound of the forest. The grandson and his men were blind, deaf, lost in their own arrogance. "He won't find me dead," the grandmother whispered, her voice hoarse but firm. "He will find me alive, and he will regret it." The grandson began to search the area, calling her name with a false concern that barely disguised his impatience. "Grandma! Grandma!" The sound of his voice echoed through the forest, a strange, dissonant noise. The wolves cowered, their eyes fixed on the intruders. The alpha, with a flick of its head, indicated a direction. It was a path that led to a denser part of the forest, a labyrinth of trees and rocks that promised disorientation. The grandmother understood. It was a trap, not of violence, but of revelation. She moved with the alpha, the other wolves following in silence, an invisible escort. The grandson and his men, following false trails and the sound of broken branches, perhaps intentionally made by one of the wolves, ventured deeper and deeper into the forest. The tension was palpable, the air charged with the expectation of confrontation. They reached a small clearing where the snow was untouched, except for a few wolf tracks. The grandson stopped, his eyes sweeping the surroundings with a mixture of frustration and growing fear. He felt the forest's presence, the oppressive silence that was not empty, but full of watching eyes. It was then that the grandmother revealed herself. She stepped out from behind a massive pine, not running, not pleading, but walking with a dignity he had never seen in her. Her hair was tangled, her clothes torn, but her eyes shone with an intensity that made him recoil. Behind her, the alpha wolf emerged, imposing and silent, its golden eyes fixed on the grandson. And then, one by one, the wolves of the pack began to appear, forming a semicircle around the clearing, their grey bodies blending with the shadows of the trees. The grandson paled. His security guards, large, trained men, froze, their hands hesitant over their weapons. They had never faced anything like this. The forest was not an enemy that could be shot. "Grandma," he stammered, his voice trembling. The shock and terror were evident on his face. He expected a body, not a queen of the forest, escorted by a pack of wolves. The grandmother did not respond with words. She raised her hand, not in threat, but in a gesture of control. The alpha wolf growled, a low, menacing sound that made the grandson take another step back. "You left me to die," the grandmother finally said, her voice calm but imbued with an authority he had never heard. "You thought the mansion would be yours, that everything would be yours." She paused, allowing her words to sink into his terror. "But the mansion is nothing. The fortune is nothing. Life, true life, is here." She gestured to the forest, to the wolves that surrounded her. "I have been reborn. And you, my dear grandson, you have nothing. You have no soul, no heart, no loyalty. You have nothing but your empty greed." The grandson tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He was surrounded, not by enemies he could bribe or intimidate, but by a primordial force he did not understand. The golden eyes of the wolves were his sentence. The grandmother took a step forward, the alpha by her side. "Go back to your city, to your empty life, the mansion. It will be used for something good, something you will never understand." She looked at the helicopter, then at him. "You are not worthy of anything my family built, and you will never have another penny of mine." With a nod to the alpha, the grandmother turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the dense foliage with the same naturalness as a wolf. The pack, in a synchronized movement, followed her, leaving the grandson and his security guards alone in the clearing, surrounded only by the silence of the forest and the echo of her words. He was defeated, not by bullets or by claws, but by the truth, by the sight of his grandmother, not as a victim, but as a force of nature, one with the savagery he had despised. The grandmother did not return to the mansion. She had found her true home, her true family. The fortune, she would use it to create a sanctuary for wildlife, a legacy that would honor the forest that saved her. She had been abandoned to die, but she had been reborn. And now she was the guardian, the matriarch of a new dynasty, not of blood, but of spirit. The forest was her kingdom, the wolves her family. And the peace she found there, in the heart of the wild nature, was a treasure that no mansion or fortune could buy. She was free, and she was alive.